Welcome to the final talk in this series and the wrap up of the executive view of dynamic leadership, one to many. Over the past few weeks, we've been looking at performance from different angles. We talked about pressure and how performance changes as demand increases. We talked about the gap between knowing and doing, and we looked at how quickly reactions form, often before we're even aware of them. If you step back, there's a common thread. It's not knowledge, it's not effort, it's access. How much of you is actually available in the moment? Because you can have the skill, the experience, the right intention, and still not be able to access it when it matters most. Today I'm pulling that view together with the simple way to not only see but to serve as a job aid for self-coaching, even in the moment when chaos seems to be all around. I'm referring to my model of 5 levels that describe how we move through our day, our weeks, our months, and therefore our life. It's all very fractal. From moments where we're reactive to moments where we're steady, to moments where we're intentional, to moments where we're operating beyond what used to be limits for us. As I walk through this, just map it to your own experience, because once you can recognize where you are now, you can change how you move. And as I've said throughout all of my talks, everything that I'm talking about, the research is already available. It just lives in different silos, so it's not brought together, and it treats the human experience as different components, but it's a big construct. And when you start working on the construct at the elements level, you start to see it. So 3 things to keep in mind. 1, access, not ability, is what matters. This is not about how capable you are. It's about how much of you can access in the moment. The second one, movement happens early. The shift between these levels happens so quickly, often before you're fully aware of it, which is why we condition it in and make it into automaticity rather than relying on the conscious engagement. And the third one is this is trainable. Where you spend your time across these different levels is not fixed. It can be trained. Just like you were trained and conditioned to do what you do today, that conditioning is available to you now. Now, as I've said, and often in these talks, I've talked about the network of neurons side and the conscious mind side, and how it's so fast over here on this end, and when you add in the pre-listening, what you have is 600 milliseconds that can change your life, literally. That 600 milliseconds is what's going on from the pre-stimulus phase, the beginning of the pre-stimulus phase, through the handoff to the conscious mind. And then the conscious mind is a lot slower, 50 bits per second versus 11 million bits per second. And in this, we also talked about this curve that happens. This is the influence curve, or impact, versus the effort curve. And what this is depicting is that when you move upstream and you do things in the network of neurons level, automaticity, it's so much easier to move the needle. And small amounts of effort have a big impact. Like anything else, if you start very early on, it just takes a very small adjustment to adjust the trajectory. But if you wait too long, imagine a plane being off course for 90% of the trip, but all in the same direction. By being off course but adjusting all the time, it's creating a very, very apparently stable experience. And that's what we do here. By doing the work on the front end earlier, upstream, we're rapidly recovering, which then looks like stability. The other thing we talked about is the pressure curve, the inverted U. Optimal pressures here. Overwhelm and disengagement are over here on the sides. And when you are stressed or disengaged, you're not going to be accessing the best version of yourself. Allostasis lives in this optimal pressure zone. You put too much on, the learning drops off, and you take too much away, learning drops off, you lose access to your capabilities. Here I also brought up a couple of new terms. Well, one new term, most people have heard of homeostasis. And homeostasis is stabilization at the status quo. Allostasis is stabilization on an upward trajectory. So the brain and nervous system is actually a prediction engine. It's constantly predicting what's going on. And when the demands exceed what it predicted, it adds in more neurotransmitter. One of the neurotransmitters, dopamine, serves as a signal amplifier, and this is where you're able to get more ability, more access to your capabilities, and this is where we can get a continuous arc. And I talk about the example of thru hikers who may start off at 7, 8, 9, 10 miles a day, but at the end of a 90-mile hike, when they're going from Mexico to Canada, for example, they're doing 30 miles a day. At the extremes, 40 miles a day. Imagine 40 miles a day, more than 50% longer than a marathon every single day, but they're not recovering. Most people who've run a marathon will tell you that it required some recovery time after that. Another one we talked about, and these are related to today, so I'm going back through them. We talked about this idea of we have chaos and we have rigidity. When we have more coherence, we reduce the amount of chaos and rigidity. So the idea is to do things on purpose to raise our coherence. And this is what we're doing in step 2 of the 7-step reset. And then this is wrapping up the executive, the one-to-many leadership. So we've talked about one-to-one is like team leadership. Executive one-to-many is leading many people at one time, or as an organization. And we talked about the use of frameworks to enable the leader to hold tension. Now, there's hundreds of frameworks. Most people have many frameworks that they've used. One of them, and here's some that we introduced, RACI, Responsible, Accountable, Consulted, and Informed. This really helps with innovation whenever you're doing something new. When you're in operational work, it's very repetitive. People are used to it. There's existing infrastructure to kind of keep things on track. But when you're doing something new, innovating, or maybe even dealing with a crisis, and I look at innovating and crisis, they use similar skills because both of them are closing a gap. So you have the RACI model, and none of these are perfect. I mean, they work until they don't, but that's why you have multiple frameworks, and that's why you're aware. But what they're doing is they're helping you hold tension, and then once you get the new structure in place, your normal skills take over. Another one, and I use this one all the time, a 2-axis model, or 2-axis framework. Effectiveness and efficiency, profit and growth, speed, quality. You can always look at these two, and one way to think about it is you work on one of them until they're out of balance, then you work on the other one. With profit and growth, it's a little bit tied, obviously, more tied to strategy, because you may have to be unprofitable a while depending on the objectives, the business objectives. But if you're a small business, I would not be putting off that profitability. You want to, and all the salespeople coming to you, it's all about growth, 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 growth. But if you don't have an eye on profitability, some of that growth could be very unprofitable, which may not show up because growth can mask problems because you're constantly getting more revenue in, but you don't want to keep playing that. Now, if you have a deep balance sheet, you have investors, and there's a plan where you're doing something for 3 years and then you're going to start extracting profit, which is often what happens with some of the technology companies or initiatives, then that's different. You're planning to be unprofitable, but I would say be careful with that, obviously, as a business owner. And then we have the OODA. Again, these aren't necessarily the best frameworks. They're just frameworks that help the executive hold tension, because holding tension is one of the requirements of being able to self-regulate. You have to be able to hold on to that tension while the organization around you catches up. And that's observe, orient, direct, and act. And you can see where emotional modulation comes into play here. This follows along with the stimulus response, because you're not just reacting, you're observing, you're orienting yourself, then you're directing, and then you act. And then the last one, we'll call it the circle of control or concern versus circle of influence. It's talked about in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. This is a big one because too many times people are worried about the circle, what they can't control. It's in the circle of concern, but it's not inside the circle of influence. So the circle of concern versus circle of influence. I said circle of control. That's a different way of saying it, but I meant circle of concern, what's in my concern versus what I can actually influence. And the more you spend time focusing on what you can influence, the more you're going to grow that. So this is nothing new. We've covered this over the past talks. What we're doing now is moving into looking at the 5 levels of leadership and how this all comes together. High performance executive leadership, wrapping up this series. I'll do one more on Monday, sort of a recap, and I'll add a longer Q&A. I know I talk about the Q&A, but we don't usually get people coming in. And then sometimes if they do come in, I don't see them because I'm not looking for them. So I'll do a more focused Q&A to answer any questions since we're wrapping it up on Monday. Now, as I've said before, this is aligned. Dynamic leadership is aligned with the emotional intelligence. There's your 4 pillars there: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. And that tracks along with what I've been talking about in this series. So self-management, we have to be able to be aware and then manage ourselves. And then that social awareness gets into creating the environment that's easy for other people to regulate. So the organization is not moving towards toxicity, but they're constantly moving towards regulation. And that's the relationship management. Self-determination theory, I include that under the umbrella of dynamic leadership because it's about intrinsic motivation. Those are the 3 pillars: autonomy, competence, relatedness. And intrinsic motivation is about the people enjoying what they're doing, not getting the motivation from outside. In other words, by leading in this way, you reinforce using the same habit capabilities, the same habit structures that build habits in the first place. You're literally leveraging the dopamine and serotonin to drive the intrinsic motivation. And we use scripts for that a different, it's praise, it's reprimand, but doing it in a certain way. I talk about red, white, and blue language, and that's in one of the past talks as well. This is the 7-step reset. This is neuroplasticity in 7 steps. We go through 33,000 decisions, stimulus response cycles a day. And this enables us to move through those in a 7-step reset, a repeatable way of doing it. And again, it's fractal. But you have to have the knowledge. And in this case, I'm talking about beliefs, priming, mindset, and physiology. And understanding, of course, how those apply in neuroplasticity. And then step 2 is returning to state. This is where I was talking about the coherence. The more coherence you have, the less you're going to be in chaos and rigidity. And by pushing on coherence, it's a much more effective way than trying to suppress chaos or trying to overcome rigidity. Like having a growth mindset is easier than trying to correct a fixed mindset. And then the conditioned reaction, that's the network of neurons, aka subconscious and the conscious mind, the 600 milliseconds that can change your life. That first sight is so fast. And I separate that because there's 2 parts of it. It's the network of neurons hands off to the conscious mind. Remember, the conscious mind cannot perceive the signal going through the network of neurons, so the subconscious transforms it into something that can be perceived by the conscious mind, a thought, words, picture, etc. But I keep it separate. I keep step 3 as both stimulus and reaction, or I should say L3, stimulus, reaction, and handoff, because then step 4 is different. Step 4, and we want to pause, and it doesn't have to be a 3-second pause. A quarter of a second is enough because it's happening so fast over here. You just need a little bit of time for the rest of that reaction formation to catch up, because we're conditioning in changes at this level, and those are conditioned in so it happens automatically, and that's going to give you what you want here, so it's more actionable in the response. Then we have the emotional modulation, and that's one of the things we condition in here. Just a quick check-in. Do I need to emotionally modulate. Do I need to modulate my emotions on this? And we talk about modulation versus regulation. Regulation is the umbrella, but you have prevention, you have modulation, which is during, and you have correction at the end. And emotional intelligence, when it talks about regulating, when you look at that, it looks, you can tell most of it is corrective because it's after the fact. And part of that is because when emotional intelligence was created, it was still thought that the subconscious is a mind. Now we know it's not a mind, it's a network of neurons, and that changes things because we can program it. Literally, you can condition, which is essentially the same as programming it. And then we have step 6, action. Assuming, and you won't need to modulate your emotions once you get this working because you're not going to be stressed out. We have prevention steps all along the way, and you're just not going to have that fight or flight. But when you do, the step is there. And then we do action. Do it, delay it, delegate it, or discard it. Because remember, this is happening every other second. And we're either going to do it right now or we're going to delay it. And delay it could be do it in 10 minutes. But the point is you're making a conscious choice. I'm not going to just react. Everything doesn't have to be answered right away. I know people, and as soon as they get a question, they're like struggling to racing for an answer. And quality is sometimes much more important than speed. And then we have 7, which is the mindfulness, return to presence, and getting back to that stable state. And that prepares us for the next one, the next round. Because if you return to stable afterwards, you're not working so hard to get back to coherence before your next step 3 comes. Then we have the 1 second model. So this is step 3. The 600 milliseconds is over here, the handoff to the conscious mind. And if we're not careful here, without this structure or without this view, you are potentially letting your response equal your reaction, and that's where you see somebody's triggered. They're just like scaling up because that's all they know. They're reacting inside their mind. They're no longer reacting to external stimulus. They're reacting inside their mind, and so their reactions off their reaction, they catastrophize, etc. And that gets into a little bit of what we'll talk about today. And here's another view of the 600 milliseconds. You can see that the first 2/10 is readiness. This is like your perpetual question. And then your orientation. So here's where we condition in some things. This is where cognitive bias starts to hit. So you can't stop the cognitive biases directly, but what you can do is be oriented so that the cognitive biases don't come into play. And the simple example is the perpetual question. Many people have a perpetual question that's something like, am I safe, or am I in trouble, or what's the problem here, or what's the next shoe to drop, versus having a perpetual question that, how does this tie into my goals, or does this tie into my goals? And by looking at it that way first, you reject the things that don't have to do with your quest. We're not facing tigers on a regular basis, so the way the system was built from thousands, tens of thousands of years of evolution, we don't need that. This is why I call it a reset. Then you have the orientation. This is the condition to your trajectory bias. This is where we condition the system to not look for threats. So, you can think of the subconscious as perceiving that 80% of all stimuli are threats. And we shift from that to realizing that 80% are positive or neutral, and only 20%, if that, are threats, and virtually none of those are tiger-level threats that need to be dealt with immediately with every bit of your adrenaline. And that changes things. Then we have mobilization. By the third 2/10, so this is 200 milliseconds, or I'll say 2/10 of a second, 2/10 of a second, 2/10 of a second. By the time you get here, remember that curve where I talked about effort and influence. That curve is starting to shift direction, shift trajectory, but you can still do something here. This is where anchors come into play. You can anchor back to a state using a predetermined, practiced anchor. Breathing works in both of these very well. You can use breathing here. Attention shifts. This is happening so quickly. Remember, 2/10 of a second. You could take a breath for 15 seconds. So a breath will get you started, but you want to shift the attention very quickly so it doesn't even get traction. And then here's the handoff to the conscious mind. So the reaction time of the conscious mind is a half second. And I'm saying add another quarter second, half second to that so that you have a full assessment of what's going on. So you're not reacting to the very first thing that comes in, which could be a threat bias. So at the core of this work today, access and 5 levels of personal leadership, how individuals recognize, regulate, and redirect in real time to restore clarity, expand access, and perform under pressure. The 5 levels of personal leadership. A simple way to understand how much of you is available in the moment. And you control more of this than you think. For years, and if you're over 50, I mean, your whole life basically has been wrapped around it's a mind, and if it's coming from a mind, it must be us, and therefore it's true, et cetera, et cetera. So it takes a lot of rethinking to do that, and that's why the 7-step reset is what it is. And it doesn't take years. We can do it in 90 days. But these are the levels. And let me go back here. I wanted to just sketch this out. We have these 5 levels. This is the 5 levels of personal leadership. At the bottom, you have collapse. This is like catastrophization at this point. This is the house is on fire, people running into chaos. If you've seen somebody triggered, you've seen somebody in a phobic response, this is what you're getting in that moment. Then we have destabilize. Things are still salvageable. You may feel the anxiety coming on. This is when people are starting to get concerned that they might have an anxiety spiral. They're starting to get stressed out. You can tell they're breathing shallow. Their physiology is tightening up. They're looking around for what. And here's what's interesting. In this phase, one is excitement and anxiety have the same energy signature, if you will, going through the neurons. And so they're often, one triggers the other. But when a person is feeling anxiety, they're literally looking, they're reacting to their own internal, right, not the external, and they're literally looking for, okay, where's this thing coming from? And they're going to find it. They will find something, and that's the challenge here. And then we have stabilized. And this is where we spend most of our time, but this is the one that we can level up. We can level this up. Most people are operating more at a functional level, and it's understandable. That's how conditioning happens. But we can level this up. You can move this stabilized up. And as you move it up, you won't even be seeing this anymore. And by the way, none of this is mental health. I'm not talking about mental health here. I'm just talking about everyday living and performing. You won't see this anymore because you're expanding the headroom on the stabilization, and as you raise the headroom, you're moving up the floor as well. And then we have agency. I talk a lot about that a lot. And then expansion. So if you change careers, take a new role, start a business, where most of us are thinking about some form of expansion, but we get stuck here because it's difficult. You have to have agency first to be able to drive this, and you have to have agency to function at what it's going to take up here. And it's not that it's so much difficult. You still have 24 hours a day. You're still going to sleep, eat, and deal with what comes your way. But you have to have a rapid recovery because there's more unexpected happening up here than was going on down here. And in the process, we're also going to recondition ourselves so that we don't have these risks anymore. That's the part that takes about 90 days, where this is no longer first of all, part of your anxiety comes because you're not sure when it's going to come the next time. So we get rid of that completely by you learning to modulate real time. And then by reorienting and having more coherence, you just don't experience the rigidity and the chaos. And then, so here it is in the reverse order from what I drew. Collapse, overwhelmed, reacting internally. That's why I wanted to draw it, because if you think about it from the bottom up, that's the idea. At the bottom is catastrophization and collapse, and then destabilization, stabilized state, baseline, where direction is set. So what this is saying is, if you are waiting until destabilized to correct, it's late. If you're waiting for collapse, it's obviously too late. And the way to get into agency is you're going to spend time, not because you have to spend time, but you have to reorient. You have to get this direction shifted to get into agency. You're going to deal with some cognitive dissonance. You're going to deal with some challenging of your beliefs, etc., to move into agency. And then we have expansion, stable while growing. This is the allostasis. I've drawn that arc many times, that upward trajectory of allostasis when you're stabilizing on an upward trajectory versus homeostasis, which stabilizes at the status quo. So what this model actually shows? Movement between levels is constant and trainable. I've said that many times. And again, everything I'm saying, you can search and find it. It's just, it lives in silos. Some of it is still in the labs, but it all exists. And nothing in here is just woo-woo. It's all backed by science and peer-reviewed science. So it's not like it worked one time, you can't get it to work again. It works over and over. You just have to be willing to dig and do the research. The lower levels, access is limited. This is the drawing I was doing, and the pressure curve. To be in that optimal point, that optimal pressure, that's where you're at the higher levels and access expands. Most people operate in a functional baseline that keeps life moving but doesn't expand what's possible. And our system, of what our environment, continues to condition this. Direction is determined at the baseline, not at extremes. Early awareness creates leverage. So these levels are not who you are. They reflect how much of you that you can access. So when I'm working with the client and I go through whether it's 7 levels of deep, 7 levels deep, asking them questions, having them talk about what they would do if they knew they couldn't fail, and why is that important to them, and what does failure look like, and what makes them think that they might fail, all of that. What I'm listening for is, what do they want? Who, them, you, the you. What do you want? And recognizing that 95% of what we do is by habit, we spend very little time focusing on what we really want, because the habits are just coming from the outside. That's the 33,000 stimulus response cycles. Every other second you're being bombarded either from your own negative thoughts or from external thoughts that trigger those negative thoughts, etc. So this is how we move from this system, this baseline, this functional baseline, into something greater. Direction is determined at the baseline, not at the extremes. And that's what I meant when I said you're choosing your direction while you're stabilized. This is when you have the most access to be able to make a difference. You don't want to wait until you're stressed out to start using meditation. You can use meditation to move in this direction. And when I created some of these models, I wanted to do so without having to rely on meditation. Nothing against meditation, but I know there are some people who are opposed to it, or they're waiting until they hit rock bottom. And so I took meditation out of it. So meditation becomes an accelerator, not a requirement. And then early awareness creates leverage. And that's the big part of what meditation does indirectly, is it helps them to move upstream. I'm doing it with conditioning by moving upstream. The end result is the same. We're moving upstream. We're stopping things before they take off. And then what actually changes? The difference between levels is access, not ability. Same person, different level of access. Thinking narrows or expands. Reactions speed up or slow down. Choices become limited or available. So that's the point here, is when you're stressed, you're not just stressed. You are limiting your access. And by limiting your access, you have less ability to deal with what comes your way, which just means more stress. So fight or flight gets more fight or flight. If you did nothing else but remove half of the fight or flight situations you're experiencing per day, you're going to have a better life, because you have more access to the best version of yourself a larger percentage of the time during the day. Where you can influence the shift. Movement between levels happens early and quickly. This gets back to the 600 milliseconds by moving things upstream. And for executives, what we're doing, we can move things upstream temporally in time, but we can also move things in orientation, focusing on the vision and the big picture. Again, that's why I like to use frameworks, because it brings people out of the weeds and lets them look at the 30,000 foot view again and orient where they are. Kind of the same with the observe, orient, direct, and act, that framework. Shifts begin before full awareness. And this is, if you are so focused on the conscious side of things, you miss the fact that all of these signals are coming up. Sensory acuity teaches us to look at the facial expressions, but even before the facial expressions, there's the sensation that happens inside. And you'll feel it, and you'll start to spot it. You can see the sensation happen inside before it shows up on the face. The face is a confirmation that there was a shift, but maybe their breathing gets shallow. Maybe their shoulders tense, their necks tense. They rear back. It's something that shifts, and you can feel it in yourself. And the more you start feeling it in yourself early, it's easier to recognize it in other people. So early recognition creates the most leverage because it's not just detecting it. We're also conditioning in the response to that, which is you obviously that person has not formed. I'm talking about the leader to the team member. The leader, the person has not formed a narrative yet around this thing. And by asking them the simple question, I just want to do a quick check-in. Let's pause here and see what's coming up for people. That gives people a chance to kind of experience that feeling and then put a label on it. And a lot of times they'll answer themselves, oh yeah, I thought it was this, but it's really not that. But if you let that thing come up and it forms a reaction, and that reaction is accepted by the conscious mind as a locked-in narrative, now it's a lot harder to change. So returning to presence restores access. So we want to get really good at returning to presence, and that's step 2. And we get there by understanding neuroplasticity and how it interacts with and how it's interdependent with beliefs, priming, mindset, and physiology. They all work together. So how well you are managing your physiology can impact your neuroplasticity, and how well you're managing your beliefs can impact your physiology and your priming, and how well you're doing that can impact your mindset. It's like a web. And that's why I like to talk about you running laps around them, because as you get better at one, you get better at the others. And as you get better at the others, you get better at the one. A repetition makes recovery faster. And so we're getting good at this process to where you don't have downtime. I actually have a visual in my mind where if a person starts meditating, let's say they meditate for 45 minutes a day, in the beginning, that state of calm might last for another 15 or 20 minutes. But after so many weeks and months of meditating, you'll see that calm will last for hours and hours. And I can imagine you get to the point where you meditate and that bliss state or calm or alpha state lasts all the way around to the next time you meditate. That's the visual. You don't have to do it with meditation. That's why the 7-step reset exists. So the earlier you recognize the shift, the easier it is to change direction. Now, this is happening all day, all the time. I talk about it being very fractal. So you change your days, you change your life. You don't stay in one level. Most time is spent in the stabilized state, but small moments determine direction, and that's why recovery is so important. You want to stay in a stabilized state, and we want to move that stabilization or that stabilized state to an upward trajectory. The patterns repeat without awareness, conscious awareness, but you are aware. That's the mental, physical, spiritual. The spiritual part of that 7 performance areas is not the spiritual realm. It's the awareness of awareness. You're aware that these sensations are coming up, and then you have to actually process and not just be aware, you have to process. I know when working with somebody to get rid of the ums, the first stage is that they recognize the ums are coming. Yeah, well, now you have to stop saying them. You don't stop saying them by stopping saying them. You stop saying them by putting in a pause. But I say that this process opens the door. You still have to go through it. And you'll see the person, they struggle at the beginning, and they'll say, I said But then eventually they're pausing, and that's the idea. It doesn't happen overnight, because it's just like you're training a dog to sit on command. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't in the beginning. Sometimes they're overstimulated. You have to get it to where it works regularly all the time. And here is a look at the 5 levels of self-leadership compared to level 5 leadership of Jim Collins. So Jim Collins talks about level 5 leadership. He came up with that because when he did the Good to Great companies, there was something unique about the leaders that was across all of them, and there wasn't a way to describe it. There wasn't a title that fit, so he came up with the term level 5 leadership. And these are some of the attributes you would see: personal humility, professional will, ambition beyond self, confront the brutal facts, discipline, thinking and action. And you'll see these show up in Good to Great as well. And then I just mapped them over to 5 five levels of self-leadership: clear self-perception, not driven by ego. This is that orientation, directed agency. You want to be directing your agency every day, resetting what's important to you, not just being at the whims of what's coming. And this is even more important now with artificial intelligence being used at so many areas of life. Artificial intelligence is using the same tools that have been used by advertisers and marketers and politicians for decades to persuade people to do things that they wouldn't normally do. It's not that artificial intelligence knows how to do it. It knows the word patterns. It knows what words to put together, and by putting those words together, it triggers cognitive biases. Ambition beyond self, and over here we have purpose over immediate relief. So, and I like to say start with purpose. So if I'm working with the client, if we can't tap into a big enough purpose, I suggest they go off and do that and think about that and figure that out. If you don't have something that's bigger than yourself, it's going to be too difficult to overcome yourself. It's not that the thing is hard to do. It's that yourself, you've been with you for so long, and yourself knows all of the buttons that needs to push. This is, I know David Goggins says the subconscious has the tactical advantage over the mind. Yeah, it does, because the subconscious has been running the show, and we have to reorient it. It's the higher self, it's the conscious mind, and these govern and program the subconscious. We've let the subconscious ride the top. I've even heard people say the subconscious is the higher self. So you can see it's nothing nefarious. It's just that it's easier to trust that. It doesn't take any thinking. It's not difficult to just follow the subconscious. The problem now is artificial intelligence is going to keep leveraging that, and these patterns are going to be repeating over and over and over. It's going to feel, for a lot of people, just like the Matrix. See reality without distortion, and this is learning to have a balance between the internal, what you're seeing inside, versus the external, being able to use first principles thinking and critical thinking to understand what you're actually looking at there. And disciplined thinking and action, regulated response under pressure. This is what we've been talking about. Level 5 leadership starts with you. So you lead yourself, then you lead others. What creates greatness externally must be accessible internally. Will, directed agency, purpose beyond immediate reaction, reality, seen without distortion. I like using first principles thinking. And then discipline and regulated response. And remember, we talk about this is all about early rapid recovery, because trying to do things with discipline and willpower in the back end is a non-starter, because willpower wanes throughout the day, discipline wanes throughout the day. You get decision fatigue. Before you can build something great, you have to access the best version of yourself, even when it matters, especially when it matters. So this is the view. This is the expansion. I talk about that level, that top level being expansion. This is it above here. And this is the destabilized, and collapsing would be down here. So we're running along here now, stable. We want this moving on a nice upward trajectory. One of the reasons why it's so hard to break through is because of all the cognitive dissonance that occurs here. You have habits and patterns and stories and bad experiences. Even good experiences can lock people into things that aren't good for them, because it worked once and they're believing that it's going to work again, and 10 years later they're still trying to make this new thing happen. And then you have all the external things, the ads and everything like that, that's telling you, and because the subconscious, when it hands off to the conscious mind, people have learned to trust that subconscious as truth, and it's just not. And then we have the upper limit is up here, and this is where you want to have the allostasis. That's the view here. And you hear me say it's fractal. This is that same thing that happened with the good to great at the organization level. This is what we do at the personal level. And you can see this when people finally break through and they're moving through. The allostasis kicks in, and they just, now there's limits. If you use the through hiker as an example, if you're walking X amount of miles per hour, there's only so many miles you're going to do in a day, but 30 and 40 miles per day is up there. I don't need to worry about a limit that's high, that is that high, right? But the reason I said this expansion is more challenging up here, because there's so much unfamiliar, there's unknown, and the unfamiliar and known are perceived by the unconscious as being a threat. And then here's the last 6 talks. So you can find the prior talks in LinkedIn events. Just go to my LinkedIn page, down to the events section, and you'll see these talks. I've been doing these live events daily from October, but I started with the crushing anxiety, then agency and personal leadership, which was some of what today was about as well. Then we did one-to-one leadership, and then one-to-many leadership, which is what this one was. And you can find those talks. These are just this last 6 I did to wrap up the executive view of dynamic leadership. And you can find more information at 7stepreset.com/live. And you can tune in for collaborations. I'm doing one on sales skills, where we bring neuroscience principles into the sales. Nothing new about selling, but it's why it works. And when you understand why it works for some people, that takes the cover. It makes things clearer. And also, the learning to sell the way people buy gives us a filter so that we're doing things on purpose for the right reasons. We're not just throwing spaghetti on the wall. All right, that's it. On Monday we will do a recap of those 6 talks. I'll do just a combined view, and then have time for a Q&A. And that wraps up this session on access, defined